Ahead and I'll introduce Greg. Greg Giusti has worked in oak woodlands and forest lands throughout the North Coast and actually statewide too. He's the primary author of the book that we're using here, The Planter's Guide to Oak Woodlands. Greg will talk to us a little bit about the planter's role in oak woodland conservation. So Greg, it's all yours for about 20 minutes.
Thank you, Rick, and good morning, everyone. Thanks, Rosie, for making me smile this morning when you learned that you had your mute button on. Took some of the nervous tension out of the air when we were reading your note there. You know, I know a lot of people on this webinar this morning. I know you personally. I know you professionally. And that when we started this exercise back in the early '90s, my challenge, at least the challenge I put on myself, was, you know, our audience, you, the people we're talking to today, are a professional group of people who do planning every single day. And those of us that are presenting this webinar today, we're not planners, but we're tree people. We're people that work in oak woodlands. And so my strategy has always been to try and provide support through the University of California for those of you who struggle with trying to do futuring, try to do planning, and are trying to conserve one of California's precious natural heritage features. So I've always looked at our opportunity here, our role here is to support the good work that all of you are doing. And so my comments today are going to be based on my own philosophy of how I started this project when I was assigned the project back in the early '90s, and just share with you some thoughts as we move forward and try and set the tone. And at the end of my slide show, to maintain that level of support that all of us want to bring to you as professionals working out in the real world, to share with you links of some new planners resources that have come out since the Planner's Guide. So this is a theme, if you will, a theme of focus that all of us have maintained for several years and hope to add to that litany of resources that we've developed for you. New computer, give me a second. I got to figure this out. There we go. Well, all of you know that people have been a part of oak woodlands for a very long time. And what has changed is not the fact that people have been a part of oak woodlands, but the expectations of the people who live and work in oak woodlands has changed from perhaps a management strategy of subsistence and survival to a strategy today where a portion of society believes that oak woodlands should offer profit through exploitation. And so as you deal with different interests of people that want to utilize oaks or exploit oak woodlands for any reason, that's the biggest things that's changed since, you know, the early Europeans, and certainly since the gold rush, when things changed dramatically. I think all of us know the reason we have planners in California, and I'm sure all of you know that this is a luxury to have planners. Many states in the Union do not have local planning departments or are struggling with different aspects of trying to get any concept of planning in conservation of resources. That we know in California, things will continue to change. People will continue to have expectations of oak woodlands, as well as, and those expectations could have some inherent conflicts as people try to perhaps seek profit off of oak woodlands, while others try and protect them just for the intrinsic values of wildlife and water and the like. There's a lot of oak woodlands in California. Again, everyone on this call this morning realizes that. What you may not realize is that about half of California is in public ownership. This slide that I'm sharing with you this morning breaks down those ownership patterns. You can see the dark green is mostly Forest Service. A lot of the lighter yellow is Bureau of Land Management. The darker yellow is Department of Defense down in the deserts. A lot of the red colored areas are Native peoples' lands. So, and then all of the white is private land. So just based on landscape ownership, there are some inherent challenges that you as planning professionals have to deal with. And for the most part, what we're talking about today are the portions in white, those portions in private ownership where NGOs, community planners, private planners are dealing with. But planning is something that everybody in resource management is dealing with today in California. You're going to see this slide probably a couple times today. I'm not going to steal Adina's thunder, but I am going to steal her slide because it's a wonderful slide that shows how different kinds of modelings can show growth changes in California, how urban areas are going to be expanding or projected to expand in the future. And as I like to point out is that, you know, there's two things that I see when I see this kind of modeling imagery in front of me. One is the increased density of people in and around these urban areas, but what are the impacts? If, you know, rhetorically, if you ask the question, what are the impacts of that increased density? Well, as always, the coin has two sides to it. So one, there's going to be a draw of resources to these highly populated areas as more people demand more water, more food, and all of these things are going to come from the landscape surrounding the immediate area, or perhaps even other parts of the world. But more importantly, as these areas increase, there's going to be more demand for people to get out of these highly urban areas and go out into the wildlands to enjoy, for recreational purposes, aesthetic purposes, peace of mind purposes, to go out into the wildlands. So just as an introduction, as Adina will talk about the need to use different emerging technologies, different types of planning tools, so that we can understand not only what the draw for these urban areas is going to be, but also the reverse side of that, how they may impact the wildlands as people continue to try and protect and conserve open space. I use that just to lead into the notion that change is not new in California's oak woodlands. Demands by people is not new. This is something that will continue, and there really will be no finish line in this discussion. Part of the challenge that you face, I believe, is not only looking at these mixed landscapes of mixed uses, but also how do you maintain a sustained ecological system? How do you protect open space that not only has those big, majestic adult trees, but what's our role as conservation professionals in trying to ensure that there'll be new trees coming along, baby trees to fill in over time and to maintain the cycle of life, if you will, out in this landscape. So as you know, most people get very upset when big oak trees go down. Certainly we all feel the loss when we see these magnificent trees get felled, but equally important is, where are the replacements? How do we think in terms of projecting growth by recruiting young cohorts across the landscape so we have a thriving, living oak woodland? I think that's the challenge for all planners to try and convince with your clients and your constituency is, yeah, the trees today are important, but really when we talk about planning, we're thinking about the trees of tomorrow and what do we have to do to ensure that there will be trees in the future. And the other thing too is, as you hear the speakers this morning and this whole program continues over the next couple of weeks, you know, we're not just talking about trees, we're talking about the other parts of an ecological system that allow that system to function. We focus on the birds, maybe we focus on salamanders, but the reason the birds and the salamanders are out there is because the forest system is providing elements that allow them to sustain themselves, perhaps seasonally, or in the case of residents, throughout the entire year. So, for example, I always throw out the concept of the importance of acorns. Certainly, acorns are important for a number of species, but remember, they're a seasonal food source. They're there in the fall. Right now, this time of year, sure, there might be an acorn or two out there, but animals that rely on acorns this time of year are relying on something else. Perhaps they're relying on berries. And then there are some species that live in the oak woodlands that don't rely on acorns at all. I've never seen a salamander try and swallow an acorn. I think they would have a challenge with that. But yet there are salamanders out in the oak woodlands that are exploiting some other attribute. And then there are habitats or components within the components, or habitats within the habitats. And coming from the North Coast, I can't escape the importance of riparian areas, creeks and rivers. And throughout California, if we look across the landscape, creeks and rivers represent about 1% of the landscape. These highly sensitive, highly defined components of the oak woodland are incredibly important, not only for wildlife, but for humans, as they serve as the pathway to provide water to people for domestic use, agricultural use, and the like. So again, throughout this webinar, I'm sure my colleagues and I will continue to tease out the different parts of the oak woodland so that we think differently, that it's not all just oak woodlands, but that perhaps riparian areas require special attention simply because they are so restricted in their distribution, and their importance is different than the importance of acorns or the importance of berries or the importance of mature trees. They're all important, but that doesn't mean they all have to be treated the same. They may need to be given equal consideration, but not necessarily treated the same. And I think that's an important consideration for all of us to mull over. And again, this notion of seasonality in oak woodlands, as we try and talk about planning, we try and think about the future. I've just finished reading a book about Teddy Roosevelt and his need to think towards the future and all of the parks and forest reserves that he set aside in the early 1900s with the specific purpose of making sure they would be there in 100 years. And so all those green lands that we saw and all the parklands of Yosemite and even Muir Woods in San Francisco, you know, that individual had the foresight to put those things aside for future generations. And I think on a smaller scale, all of us need to have that kind of approach. We all work in the here and now. The pressures of the day, the pressures of the job make us react. But if we could convince others that what we're really doing in the planning process is looking ahead for future generations, not only for human generations, but also for non-human generations. And again, the importance, for example, just an example, the importance of oak woodlands for supporting and sustaining migratory fish, for example, again, on the North Coast. This is a picture of Hopland. If those of you come up to the Hopland Field Station, we will talk about the importance of oak woodlands for migratory species like steelhead, not only in their juvenile form, but also in their adult form, as streams that move through the oak woodland provide migratory pathways for certain species. And so when we talk about ecosystem functionality or the services that those ecosystems, the oak ecosystem provides, we're layering different concepts on one another because they all are interacting and functioning together. We're talking about clean water. We're talking about habitats, functional habitats for a whole host of organisms. We're talking about human exploitation, human recreation. All of these layers, all of these pressures, all of these expectations on oak woodlands, I think make planning one of the most challenging professional jobs that anybody could get into. And I think that's why all of us have, for so many years, taken the notion of providing support to planners so seriously, because I think a lot of us recognize the pressures you're under as well as the expectations that you're trying to achieve. And there's no doubt, I mean, no matter where you are in the state, these challenges abound as conflicting land use expectations continue to surface. And I think as Adina's slide showed earlier about population expansion, as more and more people expect a slice of the pie, those conflicts are only going to intensify. And I show this example here where we've got the vineyard, which is intensive agriculture in the foreground, and the oak woodland in the background. And then on the left side, my slide, as you drive up and down, particularly in the wine country, you notice these structures. And my first thought is, why is there a box on a stick? And someone told me, no, Greg, that's an owl box. And I thought, oh, okay, well, that's nice. I appreciate the fact that somebody took the time to consider the needs of owls, but is an owl going to live in that box in the middle of July or August in the interior part of the North Coast when it's 105 degrees outside? So even though people in this particular case thought seriously about providing something for owls because they think they're important, they're beneficial to maintaining rodent populations, it's not enough to think that a box on a stick is going to be a surrogate for functioning habitat. and it's a very limited attempt to try and sustain owl populations. I'm sounding like a radio talk show host here. I realize that as I pull out one little example and try and make a big deal out of it. But I think in my mind, it illustrates the challenges that all of us have, that even though people want to do the right thing, putting up an artificial nest box certainly isn't a surrogate for maintaining functional and viable habitats across the landscape if owls are important and we want to maintain their presence in and amongst us. And other kinds of partnership or other kinds of patterns that have emerged since we started looking at this over 25 years ago. And I think we all know this. As more and more folks come into California, we have people moving out into the hinterlands, out into the wildlands, and the trend has been steady, where large ranches are being parcelized. Everybody wants a piece of the pie. Everybody wants a piece of the oak woodlands. And so we have more and more folks living out there. Everybody on this call knows that. But what's the impact of that? What's the impact of parcelization? We know there's more roads. We know there's perhaps the opportunity for more exotic plant species and animal species to be introduced. And so all of you are trying to allow people to manage a part of what is a much larger whole out there, and still trying to maintain that wholeness, I think, is part of what many of us are trying to accomplish. I just want to finish up here quickly. Rick is going to be saving all of these slides so you don't have to jot down these URLs. But we've done a lot since the Planner's Guide has come out. And there's actually a Planner's portal as part of our oak conservation website. I ask you to go and visit that. A couple of years ago, we set up an Ask the Expert link, and specifically for planners, so that we could give you real-time responses to the issues and subjects and topics that you're trying to deal with. And then Maggie Kelly on the Berkeley campus has even developed an interactive oak mapper where you can go and see if there's sudden oak death in your county, or perhaps even report new examples of sod emerging. So I invite you to go to our planners portal when you have a chance to revisit these links and look at those features that we've designed especially for planners. And please, if there's something we've missed, if there's other ideas where we can expand it, you can always share it with us, and we'll listen to your input sincerely. Other things that we've developed in the meantime, again, here's another link for you, an expansion. We purposely designed a plan through the Planners Portal, an oak woodland impact decision matrix. Recent legislation is requiring planners to evaluate the impacts of non-agricultural projects under CEQA. And the question we got over and over again, well, when is a project significant? Here's a process by which we've outlined to help you get to a determination of whether or not a process or a project is determined significant under CEQA. And again, it respects the professional talent of this audience, and it's there in a supportive role to give you ideas of how to approach your job. And lastly, I'm going to finish up there. Again, we've got a lot of information coming your way today. We'll be looking at the chat. I'll ask Rick to explain how we're going to handle questions. But the premise of the entire Planner's Guide, as I mentioned, is to serve in a supportive role for those of you that all of us admire what you're doing and are very grateful that you're doing your jobs. So thank you, and Rick, I'll turn it over to you.